Imagine a world split in two. On one side, the United States and its allies, champions of democracy and capitalism. On the other, the Soviet Union and its satellite states promoting communism. This wasn't a war fought with guns and tanks, not directly at least. This was the Cold War, a clash of ideologies, a battle for the hearts and minds of the world. From the end of World War II in 1945 until the early 1990s, this rivalry shaped global politics. It fueled proxy wars, espionage, and a terrifying nuclear arms race. The fear of annihilation hung heavy in the air, a constant reminder of the stakes. But behind the political maneuvering and military posturing were human stories. Stories of families divided by the Iron Curtain, of spies risking it all for their beliefs, of ordinary people caught in the crossfire of a conflict they didn't choose. This is their story. This is the story of the Cold War. To understand the Cold War, we need to rewind the clock back to the Russian Revolution of 1917. The Tsar is overthrown, and from the ashes rises a new power, the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin. They bring with them a radical ideology, communism, promising equality and worker control. The West, deeply suspicious of this new ideology, watches with a wary eye. The distrust runs deep, fueled by fears of communist revolutions spreading beyond Russia's borders. The execution of the Tsar and his family only deepens the divide. Fast forward to the aftermath of World War I. Russia, ravaged by revolution and civil war, is isolated. The West, meanwhile, grapples with its own scars. The seeds of mistrust have been sown, creating fertile ground for future conflict. World War II forces an uneasy alliance. The United States, Great Britain and the Soviet Union find themselves on the same side, united against a common enemy, Nazi Germany. But beneath the surface, tensions simmer. The Soviets, having borne the brunt of the fighting in Eastern Europe, feel their sacrifices aren't fully appreciated. They want assurances, guarantees that their security will be protected in the post-war world. The US and Britain, meanwhile, are wary of Soviet ambitions in Eastern Europe. Conferences at Yalta and Potsdam, intended to shape the post-war order, only expose the growing rift. Agreements are made, but suspicion lingers. The stage is set for a new kind of conflict, one where former allies become rivals on a global stage. Winston Churchill delivers a chilling speech in 1946. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, he warns, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. His words ring true. Eastern Europe falls under Soviet influence, with communist governments installed in Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and elsewhere. The US, alarmed by the spread of communism, responds with a policy of containment. The Truman Doctrine pledges support to any nation resisting communist pressure. The Marshall Plan offers billions in aid to rebuild war-torn Europe, hoping to stem the communist tide. A new phrase enters the global lexicon, the Cold War. It's a war of ideology, of espionage, of proxy conflicts fought on distant battlefields. The world holds its breath, bracing for a confrontation that could escalate at any moment. Section 5. Berlin, a city divided, a world on edge. Berlin, a city scarred by war, becomes a microcosm of the Cold War. Divided into sectors controlled by the victorious powers, Berlin becomes a flashpoint. In 1948, Stalin, seeking to force the West out, blockades all land access to West Berlin, hoping to starve the city into submission. The US and its allies refused to back down. Instead, they launched the Berlin Airlift, a daring humanitarian effort. For over a year, planes loaded with food, medicine and supplies land around the clock, keeping West Berlin alive and defying Soviet pressure. The Berlin Airlift becomes a symbol of Western resolve. It also highlights the stark reality of a divided Europe, a continent caught in the grip of a new kind of conflict. The Cold War has come to define the world stage. Section 6. The nuclear shadow living on the brink. The atomic age dawns in 1945 with a terrifying display of power, the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The world, still reeling from the horrors of World War II, now faces a new and even more destructive threat: nuclear war. The US, initially the sole possessor of nuclear weapons, soon faces a rival. The Soviet Union tests its own atomic bomb in 1949, shattering the American monopoly and ushering in an era of nuclear proliferation. The arms race begins. Both sides pour massive resources into developing increasingly powerful weapons. Intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs, promise to deliver nuclear warheads across vast distances, making the entire world a potential battlefield. The world watches with a mixture of fascination and fear as the doomsday clock, a symbol of global vulnerability, creeps closer to midnight. The Cold War has taken on a terrifying new dimension. Section 7. Cuba, 13 days that shook the world. In October 1962, the world teeters on the brink of nuclear war. The Cuban Missile Crisis, a 13-day standoff between the US and the Soviet Union, becomes the most dangerous moment in human history. The crisis begins with the discovery of Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from US shores. President John F. Kennedy, vowing to protect American security, imposes a naval blockade on Cuba, demanding the removal of the missiles. For days, the world holds its breath. Tensions escalate as Soviet ships approach the blockade line. The possibility of a nuclear exchange, accidental or intentional, seems all too real. Finally, after tense negotiations, a deal is struck. The Soviets agree to remove the missiles from Cuba, and the US, in a secret agreement, pledges to withdraw its own missiles from Turkey. The crisis is averted, but the world is left shaken to its core. The fragility of peace and the devastating consequences of nuclear war have never been clearer. Section 8. Cracks in the wall, détente and dissatisfaction. The Cuban Missile Crisis serves as a wake-up call. The world has looked into the abyss and both superpowers step back from the brink. A period of détente or eased tensions follows. Arms control agreements like the SALT-Y Treaty limiting strategic arms are signed. There's a sense of cautious optimism, a hope that the Cold War's most dangerous phase might be over. But beneath the surface, problems simmer. The Soviet Union, bogged down in a costly war in Afghanistan, faces growing economic stagnation. In the West, dissatisfaction with détente grows, with some arguing that it only emboldens the Soviets. The Cold War is far from over. It simply entered a new, more complex phase. Section 9. The walls come tumbling down, Gorbachev and the end of an era. In 1985, a new leader takes the helm in the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev. Young, dynamic and committed to reform, Gorbachev ushers in an era of glasnost, openness and perestroika, restructuring. Gorbachev's reforms, intended to revitalize the Soviet system, inadvertently set in motion forces that will lead to its collapse. He meets with US President Ronald Reagan, and together they sign landmark arms control agreements. In 1989, the Berlin Wall, a symbol of Cold War division for nearly 3 decades, falls. Across Eastern Europe, communist regimes crumble, replaced by democratic governments. The Soviet Union itself dissolves in 1991, marking the end of the Cold War. The world watches in amazement as a new era dawns. The Cold War, a conflict that shaped a generation, is finally over. Section 10. The legacy of a Cold War echoes in a new millennium. The Cold War may be over, but its legacy continues to shape the world we live in today. From the geopolitical landscape to the global economy, the echoes of this conflict can still be felt. The US emerges from the Cold War as the sole superpower, but it faces new challenges: terrorism, climate change, and the rise of new global powers. The threat of nuclear war, while diminished, still looms. The Cold War also left an indelible mark on popular culture. From James Bond films to iconic music, the conflict provided a backdrop for exploring themes of espionage, ideological struggle, and the ever-present threat of annihilation. The Cold War was a time of great tension and uncertainty, but it also produced moments of courage, resilience, and ultimately hope. As we navigate the complexities of the 21st century, The lessons of the Cold War, the importance of diplomacy, the dangers of unchecked power and the enduring human spirit remain as relevant as ever.